Next, an Armenian journey. Why did 1 million Armenians perish in eastern Turkey 73 years ago? Journalist Theodore Bogosian travels across 3 continents to uncover the links between a centuries-old Muslim and Christian conflict, a world war, and a genocide. A new understanding of an ancient nation that survived, and a people who triumphed on an Armenian journey.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Alex and Marie Manoogian Foundation, this station, and other public television stations nationwide, and the Louise Simone Fund.
Recent ethnic riots in 2 Soviet republics, Armenia and Azerbaijan, were the most serious outbreaks of national unrest in the Soviet Union since the 1920s. The new Soviet climate of openness fueled these disturbances, but the main source of the unrest is an ancient religious conflict between Christian Armenians and Muslim Turks. An Armenian Journey investigates the darkest period in this ancient conflict, the death of more than 1 million Armenians in 1915.
For generations, Armenians have mourned events that took place in eastern Turkey almost 75 years ago. Events that threatened to eliminate the Armenian people from this earth. During World War I, the Armenians were uprooted from their ancient birthplace and pushed to the brink of extinction. By most estimates, more than 1 million people of Armenian descent lost their lives in just 1 year. 3/4 of the Armenians in Ottoman Turkey perished. Almost ever since, a bitter debate has raged over who was responsible for the near annihilation of the Armenian people. Were the Armenians simply casualties of war, as the Turkish government to this day insists? Or was it genocide, a deliberate effort by Turkish officials to exterminate the Armenian people? Each April, the world's Armenians gather to commemorate the events of 1915. Like most Americans of Armenian descent, I grew up hearing accounts of terrible crimes committed by the Turks against my people. My name is Theodore Bogosian. As a journalist, I came to find the conflict between the Armenian accounts and the persistent denials of the Turkish government intolerable. So I set out to find the truth, if I could. Who was responsible for the death of more than 1 million Armenians in eastern Turkey almost 75 years ago? At the turn of the century in the Ottoman Empire, a revolution brought to power a trio of military officers who came to be known as the Young Turks. Seeking to unify an empire in decline, the new rulers moved to assimilate all minorities within their Muslim domain, from the rebellious Kurds to the largest Christian minority, the Armenians. By 1915, almost 2 million Christian Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire, along the Russian border. This region had been the Armenians' homeland for almost 3,000 years. Once a nation, Armenia was the first country in the world to adopt Christianity as a national religion. For 1,000 years, despite a series of conquests by Muslim invaders, the Armenians clung to their Christian faith. By the 20th century, their religion had left them isolated in a Muslim world. When the young Turks pressured them to abandon their religion, the Armenians resisted. In World War I, when the Ottomans joined on the side of Germany, many Armenians refused conscription into the Ottoman army. Some fled the country to join the Allies, hoping that an Allied victory would lead to the resurrection of the Armenian nation. A few Armenians went underground, forming groups of armed resistance within the country. The Armenian rebellion was not widespread, but it served in 1915 as a reason for the young Turks to order a roundup of all Armenians in eastern Turkey. Newspaper accounts of the time report that what began as mass deportations ended in the death of nearly 1 million Armenians, 3 out of every 4 living in eastern Turkey. Within a single year, the Armenians had been virtually eliminated from their ancient homeland. Most of those who survived were children who would grow up in countries far away. In the memories of many of those children, the tragedies that befell them became known as the Armenian Genocide, by which is meant a Turkish government-directed policy of murder. Mariam Davis was one of those children who survived.
They did this terrible thing, killing so many Armenians, and I know they did, because I saw a lot of it. Walking through fields, I saw it. Walking through villages, I saw it. Walking through cities, I saw it.
In the spring of 1915, when Mariam was 5 years old, she and her family were among the Armenians rounded up in eastern Turkey. They were marched from their home in Terjan down the north side of the Euphrates River to the town of Agan. Mariam was the only member of her family to escape death. For 4 years, she survived as a homeless child in the town of Arapkir. Adopted by a Christian missionary, Miss Elsie Tanner, she grew up in New York City. Today, Mariam is approaching 80 and lives in southern Mexico, near the ruins of Monte Alban. I was drawn to Mariam's testimony for 2 reasons. Unlike most survivors, Mariam has photographs and documents that prove she lived in eastern Turkey during the deportations. But just as important, Mariam's own tragic tale is typical of the horrifying stories that young Armenians, including myself, heard when we were growing up. We talked about the fate suffered by her family after they were rounded up for deportation.
And we crossed the Euphrates. They drove us across the Euphrates. And
Who was they?
The Turks, the soldiers. And then we camped there for a day or 2, and they took my brother, big brother, away. He must have been older, much older, and we never saw him again. So we picked up whatever we had, and the poor little donkey packed the stuff on that and moved all the way down to Agan. And at first we got to near to Erzincan. And there, my grandmother couldn't come anymore. She just was too worn out and starved, hungry. So we left her right there and went on because we were driven. Golly, it gets very sad. And the Kurds came down in herds, rode horses and came down and took whatever that was left away from us. And my mother tried very hard to protect us as well as she could. the Kurds would come down, and happened before, and we were told by other people that were on the march, that they would grab the kids, babies, and throw them in the lighted bushes, which they did, and I saw one. And then we went on, and of course the Kurds had taken everything that we had, and we got down to Aygin, and we found a place. We were driven into the city. We found a place where my nurse, mother, little brother, and I stayed. And since we had nothing to sell, nothing to eat, I was sent out to see if I could beg something. And of course, I couldn't beg much. We used to, all of us, go down to the beach on the Euphrates banks and see all these bodies bobbing up and down. And so after I had gone to beg for a little while, when I came back, why, my mother wasn't there, and my brother wasn't there. And I went down, and Mother had just dug a hole and put my brother in it.
Your little brother?
My little brother had died.
And how old was he?
He must have been, 2.5, 3 years old. And I can't remember the time element at all. Then I went off one day, the following day or the day after, and the Turks collected all these people and put them in this one room. And I was petrified. I wanted to get back to Mother. And there was no way except a little tiny window way up high. And there were a number of people in there that helped me get up to the window, and I got myself out and fell down this embankment. I was knocked out for a while, but when I came to, I went up to the house to see about Mother, and she wasn't there. And I knew right then and there that she had died. So I went down, and, well, before that, before that, Mother and I had gone down the day before that, and my brother was dug up by the dogs, and his head was one place, and his arms, legs, another place. We collected and put it all back in the sand grave. But that following day or the day after, when I was put in this room, I came back and my mother wasn't there, and I went down and she was in the water, dead.
And that left you all alone?
And left me all alone, and I was holding on to her, and Hoji came along, a Turkish priest came along on a donkey and saw me crying and yelling and carrying on. So he came over to see what was happening, and he saw that I was holding on to Mother, and he got me free and got a stick and pushed her body into the river, and she floated down, and he picked me up and put me back of his little donkey that he was riding and got me to Arab Kir. And that was that. So that was the end of my family.
Outside of eastern Turkey, the world was aware of the plight of the Armenian people. Commenting on the deportation of Armenians from Turkey, U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau wrote,
"The treatment which was given the convoys clearly shows that extermination was the real purpose of the Young Turk leadership.
By the winter of 1915, the tragedy of the Armenians was reported around the world. At the end of World War I, the Turkish government itself did not dispute that the Armenian deportation was in fact a program of extermination. But following the fall of the Young Turks and the rise to power of a new government, the official Turkish position shifted. Armenian scholar Theodore Bogosian.
The official Turkish position has been one of flat and blanket denial. They've dismissed this evidence as biased or anti-Turkish. Instead, they have promoted their own version of the story. They do admit that the Armenians were deported, but that these deportations were dictated by the war circumstances, and that there was no premeditated genocide.
Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey, denied there had ever been a policy to exterminate the Armenians. From Ataturk to the present, the official Turkish position has remained. The Armenian dead were casualties of war and not the victims of government policy. In the intervening years, Turkey gradually rebuilt itself into a world power. Today, it's a cornerstone of NATO, with key sites for nuclear arms and intelligence gathering. Western allies, including the United States, have respected the Turkish position on the question of what happened in eastern Turkey 75 years ago. On that question, it is the policy of the Turkish government to remain silent. The Turkish position may only be approximated in the views of historians sympathetic to the Turkish government. Justin McCarthy.
My own feeling is that the greatest problem with what you call the Armenian position, which of course is what many Armenians believe, is the use of the word genocide. To call this genocide implies that it's something that's somehow akin to what Hitler did to the Jews. And I think that's wrong. I think it's simply a misstatement. It's the kind of word that incenses people, that makes them angry, and thus makes it all the harder for us to really get at the truth.
Professor McCarthy questions much of what is offered as evidence. He is skeptical of most of the published accounts of the time.
I think they're almost completely prejudiced. The New York Times in particular, and any number of others. We're talking about people that were extremely pro-Allied in a war. And these are the days of the worst of yellow journalism. To find anything good said about a central power was almost impossible.
Professor McCarthy is also familiar with the photographs offered as evidence of massacres of Armenians.
I don't think photographs are particularly valuable because, after all sides in an issue always have pictures of unfortunate events, the traditional babies on a bayonet sort of thing, all of which happened on all sides. I mean, everyone did that kind of thing.
But if questions might be raised about pictures and old newspaper accounts, there was one source it seemed no one would challenge: records of the Turkish government itself, including those from the war crimes trials that ended just after World War I with convictions and death sentences for the Young Turk leadership: General Talat, General Enver, and General Jamal.
Between 1919 and 1921, an Ottoman court-martial sat in Istanbul to try the Young Turk leadership for war crimes and crimes against the Armenians. The proceedings, the records of these trials were published as supplements to the Takvim-i Vakai, which was the official gazette of the Ottoman government. But these supplements are nowhere to be found, and therefore the record I have of these trials is extremely incomplete, inadequate.
After searching American and European archives without success, Dr. Bogosian concluded the missing Turkish records could only be found in other government archives that have been virtually inaccessible.
I'm sure that these supplements are available in Turkey and might conceivably be available, say, in the Soviet Union or other countries. And if we could get and a complete set of the trials, I'm sure that we will be able to fill in the gaps we have in our knowledge about the genocide.
Because I was barred from archives in Turkey, where it is illegal even to speak of the Armenian massacres, Professor Bogosian suggested I carry my search to Yerevan, the capital of Soviet Armenia. Here in the shadow of Mount Ararat, the peak that once rose from the center of the Armenian nation, the Armenian genocide is not disputed. Half of the world's now 8 million Armenians live in Soviet Armenia. Although this Russian Republic is only a fraction the size of the ancient Armenian homeland, its dense population and proximity to eastern Turkey have turned Soviet Armenia into a mecca for Armenians around the world. On a hilltop overlooking Yerevan, not far from where their ancestors died nearly 75 years ago, each April they observe a day of remembrance of the genocide. This central commemoration takes place at the Martyrs' Monument. I came to Yerevan not just to honor the past, but to search for the records of the court-martial that might finally answer the question of what happened across the border in eastern Turkey 75 years ago, and why. I began at the Central Archive of Ancient Armenian Manuscripts. I hope that here, amid some of the oldest and most valuable Christian relics on earth, I would be able to locate official Turkish documents from the early 1900s. Unfortunately, this archive had few entries from the 20th century. But I did turn up an important lead here. An archive nearby had just received a lengthy document written in Ottoman Turkish, rumored to be the record of the war crimes trials. But no one in Yerevan could translate that archaic language, so its contents were unconfirmed. When I requested a copy to bring home for translation, I learned that photocopying is strictly regulated inside the Soviet Union. It would take 1 week for my request to even be considered. In the meantime, the entire country was closing down for the annual May Day celebration. I could only watch and wait, unsure whether I would get the document at all, unsure what it would mean if I did. For an Armenian-American journalist, that week-long waiting period turned into a curious and very moving experience. For the very first time in my life, I had a chance to immerse myself in a completely Armenian environment. I imagined what my world would have been like if the massacres had never happened. If all of the faces that normally surrounded me were Armenian faces, and if Armenian were my native tongue instead of English. It was sometimes very easy to forget that I was inside the Soviet Union. Although even at an ancient Armenian monastery, reminders of political reality punctuated my experience. There, I watched Russian sentries patrolling the Turkish border. Across the border zone, in Turkey, NATO forces were better hidden. At the mother church of the Armenian religion, I was surprised to find so many Soviet Armenians enjoying open worship on an ordinary Sunday morning. The crush that attended the weekly procession of the Pope of the Armenian Church, His Holiness Vaskan I, was a scene I never would have dreamed possible behind the Iron Curtain. Now that Armenians are scattered all across the world, the Armenian Church is the force that keeps the Armenian national spirit alive. Without their church, the Armenians would not have endured as a people, and their history might have ended with the events in eastern Turkey 75 years ago. As I walked Yerevan's ancient city just a few days before my visa was to expire, I was troubled by the thought that I might soon have to leave the Soviet Union without the evidence I had come for. But the night before I left for home, the Turkish manuscript I had come 8,000 miles and waited for so impatiently was quietly delivered to my hotel. Its title page seemed to confirm the document was the long-missing trial record, but without a complete translation and scholarly authentication, nothing could be certain. The document was written in Old Turkish, a rare and difficult language few outside of Turkey know how to translate. Back at Harvard, it would take Dr. Bogosian months to decipher the manuscript. Upon translation, it would turn out that these 254 pages held an extraordinarily detailed account from official Turkish sources of events in eastern Turkey in 1915. While Bogosian worked, I decided I would make a search of a different kind. I decided to make a trip to eastern Turkey with Mariam Davis. Mariam, who was 76 years old, made the journey with her daughter Joan. We traveled during the tourist season and carried only an 8mm camera to record our findings. In the hotel room on the eve of the journey, dusk found us somber. We were about to embark on a highly illicit project, violating a series of Turkish laws. Returning to what had been both Mariam Davis' home and the place where her entire family had perished. Uncertain of the risks, not knowing what we would find, we had come halfway around the world to spend 24 hours in the place Mariam had last seen 66 years ago, a town in eastern Turkey called Arapkir. The Turkish driver of the taxi we hired spoke no English and was unaware of the purpose of our journey. As a precaution to avoid being discovered, we agreed not to use the word Armenian and to pretend we were just shooting home movies. Halfway to Arapkir, the terrain began to seem familiar to Mariam. We had entered the territory that once was Armenia. Stirred by distant memories, Mariam called for the taxi to stop at the edge of a wheat field. In the distance, she sighted a tiny village that reminded her of the one where she was born.
To think that this all was taken away from us. And it's very hard not to think about it being yours. Every bit of it. What else can I say? Except I'm very unhappy. Have been for so many years. I'm glad to be here to see it. Probably it's the last time. So.
Does it look very familiar to you?
Oh God, yes. It's marvelous. It's just like the way it looked in my town, Turkey.
Arapkir, where Mariam lived after her family was killed. The highway on the outskirts of town was lined with modern houses, and Mariam recognized nothing.
These are all new.
But nearer the center, the town began to look more familiar to her.
There's an old house. That's a very old one.
In this old quarter more than 60 years ago, Mariam had survived for 3 years as a street urchin.
Come on over here. I'll show you where I learned to sew. Come on with me. Come. Down here in this street was a little shop halfway down that had a Singer sewing machine and a tailor, and I used to sit there and take threads, snarl threads, and wind them up on sticks. And I learned to sew here. All right. Well, over here is the mosque. And I used to, being dressed in boys' clothes, I was allowed to go in there and clean up their prayer rugs. And then this is where the one and only doctor was, right here in this building. And I sat here when I was sick. This is all new. I sat here when I was sick. And there's a flight of stairs. It's there. It's there, see? The flight of stairs. And I used to go in there at nighttime. I couldn't go there during the day. And this was a bathhouse. They used that for a bathhouse. It's an old church. Let's go. Gosh. This was where the brass, Joni, this is where the brass came, right here. And I used to go in there and polish brass. Isn't that fantastic? And we go on up here. This used to be all full of little shops that opened out. And down below, we'll have to go down back. Down below, we will see where they sold wheat and corn and stuff. And there was one shop that had a lot of plastic bracelets. And I just couldn't resist working for those bracelets. I had 12, 14 of them. My arms are just heavy. So, but they opened, the windows opened out like shutters instead of these. So it's wonderful. Gosh. Yeah. How many years ago? Here's the tailor. Shall we go back down?
Sure. If this is the end of the street you remember, let's go back.
Oh, I remember all of it now. You can go on, but there isn't too much. I kept down here more.
Let's walk down then.
Yeah.
In the excitement of rediscovering Arab Kir, Mariam forgot the need for caution.
Before, now these kids are walking around. Before, they were only Armenians and children, hungry. They would follow me down, and dogs. I had lots of friends.
At midday, we stopped at a bakery where the proprietor invited us to have lunch. The kindness of the shopkeepers surprised me, but not Mariam, who remembered the Turkish townspeople who had replaced the Armenians in Arab Kir.
I have a feeling that they're the descendants of the merchants that I worked for here, all of these second and third generation. Isn't it amazing? I can almost see their faces. They're so wonderful.
The merchants were Turkish.
They were Turkish, but they were kind to me. I can't say that they weren't. They were kind. It was the others that lived up north, up above here, that weren't so kind. Gosh, I've talked about Arab Kir for so long. Here I am, practically having tea in the bakery that I had tea years ago and made it. I made the tea.
After lunch, some of the townspeople became suspicious. They asked if Mariam was an Armenian who had come from Arab Kir. As we agreed she would, Mariam lied, saying she was just an American tourist.
No, America.
America?
Yeah.
But by mid-afternoon, we had become uncomfortable with the attention we had drawn.
Yeah.
Reluctantly, we decided to leave Arab Kir and go on to Aygin, the village on the banks of the Euphrates where Mariam last saw her mother. At Aygin, we found a dam had made a large lake in place of the rushing river that Mariam remembered. But it didn't stop the flow of memories.
One of the reasons why we love the river was the fact that it came through our house in Terjan. We had a Sakia little ditch, going right through the middle of our house, right from the Euphrates. And somehow we felt very close to it. Well, I guess things do change. Such a vast amount of water. This is where my mom died. And my brother. So often I think about it, and occasionally I have nightmares trying to pull her body out. And my brother's body being buried in the sand, picking the pieces up and putting them back. Well, I guess this is it. Of course, all the different memories that I've had in the past are little tiny memories that sort of connect together, but I don't know how to express it. I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to feel. I feel just dead. Some days I think, well, it happened to so many of us that just me alone didn't mean much. But millions of them, millions of kids, it's pretty hard, pretty awful. I like to put these flowers in the water just as a memory. and my brother and my mother.
In 24 hours in eastern Turkey, Mariam Davis had visited the present and recovered her past. But her story amounts to just an anecdote in the history of the Armenian people. Biased, people might say, because she is Armenian. But 3 months later, Mariam Davis' childhood memories were validated when Professor Bogosian called to tell me that the translation and authentication of the Turkish document was completed. The document describes the court-martial by the Turkish government of the young Turk leadership. The trials lasted 3 months and were held in Constantinople's Great Hall of Justice. Many of the defendants were tried in person, although the top leaders had to be tried in absentia because they fled Turkey just before the Allied victory. Bogosian's work revealed that several Turkish government officials testified, and many official Turkish documents, some confidential, were entered into evidence. On the 5th of July, 1919, a 5-member military panel reported their findings. The Supreme Young Turk leadership, General Talat, General Enver, and General Jamal, were found guilty in the first degree as the principal authors of several war crimes, including crimes against the Armenians. The verdict states,
"The massacres and felonies perpetrated against the Armenians in eastern Turkey were organized and ordered to be carried out by the Young Turk leadership."
In accordance with Turkey's civil criminal code, these officials were judged to have committed crimes of the gravest nature, and all 3 were sentenced to death in absentia. Following a local trial for the region just north of Terjan, the town from which Mariam Davis and her family were deported, the local Young Turk leaders were also sentenced to death for exterminating the Armenians. That verdict reads,
While giving the appearance of applying the law of deportation, in fact, in accordance with secretly communicated orders, they decided upon measures to bring about the massacre and annihilation of the Armenians.
These measures included murder by mass drowning and forced marching.
They made them march on foot on the road for months on end, to such an extent that they dragged themselves to the point of exhaustion. Many of them died of hunger, thirst, and the hardships of the trek.
In Aygin, the town where Mariam's mother and baby brother died, the court found that a secret elite corps of Turkish cavalry had been used to annihilate the Armenians. Its leader was sentenced to death for his crimes. During that trial, the Turkish Third Army commander gave the following testimony.
The massacre and annihilation of the Armenians and the pillage and violent seizure of their possessions were the result of decisions of the Young Turk leadership.
Bogosian also stressed that the tribunal went out of its way to disassociate the Turkish people from the crime, and it condemned the Young Turk government for issuing this order.
Any Muslim who tries to harbor or protect an Armenian is to be summarily executed in front of his place of residence, and his house shall be burned down.
At last, it seemed, there was the proof of genocide, assembled by the Turks themselves.
I believe that this is the first complete record of Turkish evidence which conclusively proves that the Armenian genocide was a premeditated act planned and carried out by certain elements of the Ottoman government and the ruling party. This is a very, very significant piece of evidence. How significant? Next to resurrecting the Turkish criminals themselves to confess to the crime they committed, I can't think of better evidence.
Remembering the millions who came to the Martyrs' Monument in Yerevan, I now hoped that the tragedy of the Armenian people would finally find universal confirmation, that the new evidence we had uncovered would permit Armenians all over the world, even in the United States, to commemorate the Armenian genocide as Soviet Armenians do, free from doubt and denial. But the Armenian question would not be so easily settled. Yes, I had found the trial records, and yes, the trials had offered proof gathered by the Turks themselves against their own. But would that put the question to rest? I took the trial records to Professor McCarthy, who presents the Turkish view in academic circles. Professor McCarthy insisted the trials had been a sham, conducted only to satisfy the victorious Allies.
After all, the Turks were not at that time, the Ottomans were not at that time in charge of their own house. They had lost the war. And so the kind of evidence they could show against the political enemies, against the people that lost the war, was evidence that would look good to the British and the French and the Americans.
So you're saying that even if the takvimi contains evidence that Ottomans were found guilty of planning and conducting the extermination of the Armenians, this could not be considered legitimate evidence among historians?
Well, extermination is not a word I'd use. The material in the Takvimi Vikaya is intended to assassinate the characters of people in the Committee of Union and Progress, because their enemies had taken over the government. And they were using the court system and the Takvimi Vikaya to attack the people who had been in charge during the war. So it's by no means a neutral source. It's nothing like that.
For those who choose to deny the Armenian genocide, I have come to see that there is no such thing as undeniable evidence. What was commonly reported when it happened is today considered by some a non-event. The victims simply casualties of war. What an American ambassador who eyewitnessed the events called extermination, our own American government today will not comment on. Newspaper accounts of the time are rejected as yellow journalism. Graphic pictures merely detail unfortunate events. A river that was choked with bodies of Armenian dead is now a lake where the wind drives a bunch of flowers in silence on its surface. The vivid memories of an old woman who saw her family perish are dismissed. And the Turkish court-martial records that describe the Armenian genocide in great detail are also dismissed, labeled sham proceedings put on by the vanquished for the victors. The search I undertook for a truth no one could deny remains unfulfilled. But I did come in my search to discover something greater and more important: the strength, the immortality of the Armenian spirit that has endured despite all challenge and denial. In my search, I found another truth that could not be denied. In a living people scattered across the globe, I found a nation.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Alex and Marie Manoogian Foundation, this station, and other public television stations nationwide, and the Louise Simone Fund. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to An Armenian Journey, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134.